The afternoon had been stitched together from ordinary things. Sunlight pooling on the sidewalk like spilled honey. The soft whir of a ceiling fan drifting out of the corner diner each time the door swung open. The faint smell of fried dough and coffee riding the warm air. But the moment it happened, the whole street seemed to inhale and forget how to exhale. Because right there, in the middle of downtown, under the lazy shadow of a streetlight, a little girl stopped so suddenly, the soles of her sneakers squeaked, lifted her arm with a kind of instinctive certainty that didn't match her small frame, and pointed straight across the flow of pedestrians at a man she'd never seen before. And if anyone had been watching closely, they would have noticed the way her face changed first. How her brows tightened, as if something inside her had recognized a wrong note. Before the retired police dog at her side changed even faster. Because the K9 didn't bark and he didn't lunge, he just went rigid, like a switch had been flipped deep in his spine, head rising, ears snapping forward, eyes locking onto the stranger with a focus so sharp it felt like a beam of light. And the leash that had been slack a heartbeat ago went taut in the veteran handler's hand as the dog's weight shifted forward, not into chaos, but into that controlled, professional stillness that seasoned officers describe with one word: ready. People nearby didn't understand what they were seeing at first. Some assumed it was just a dog reacting to a new scent. Some smiled like it was a cute moment. Some barely looked up from their phones. But then the dog's posture held, unwavering, and the handler's body changed too, shoulders setting, feet angling, his stance widening by inches that might as well have been miles. And that was when the street started to feel different. Like the temperature dropped in the shade, even though the sun was still bright. Like the chatter from the storefronts, thinned into a hush that pressed against eardrums. Because calm competence has its own gravity. And when a veteran moves like that, people feel it even if they can't name it. The stranger, mid-30s maybe, clean jacket, easy stride, the kind of face you'd forget 10 minutes later, was walking with the casual confidence of someone used to blending in. But at the exact moment the girl's finger found him, his steps hitched. Not much. Just a tiny stutter in the rhythm, and it was small enough that most would miss it. Yet the dog didn't miss anything. The K9's gaze pinned him as if reading the shape of his breath, the angle of his hands, the way his shoulders rolled. And the handler felt the leash vibrate with silent warning. Felt the dog's muscles coil beneath the fur like cable tightening under strain. The little girl's voice came out thin but clear, cutting through the afternoon like a snapped twig. "Him," she said. Not loud, not dramatic, just certain. And her finger didn't waver. And now the bystanders did look, because children point at balloons and ice cream. Children point at pigeons and funny hats. But they don't point like that. The dog's reaction wasn't playful. It was precise. And suddenly you could see the ripples of attention spread. One head turning, then another, then a couple stepping aside, then the cashier at the corner store leaning out with a frown. And in the middle of it all, the handler's hand tightened around the leash without yanking, just anchoring, his other arm subtly moving back behind him. Not to grab anything, but to create a wall, a human barrier between the child and whatever the dog had decided was a threat. The K9's chest rose and fell in slow, measured breaths. And then, quiet as a fuse beginning to hiss, a low growl started in the back of his throat, not loud enough to sound like a scene, but deep enough to be felt in the bones. And that was the moment the stranger's polite smile appeared like a mask pulled from a pocket as he turned his head and met the dog's stare. And the handler thought one hard thought he didn't let touch his face. This isn't random. And whatever the little girl just recognized, Whatever the dog just confirmed was about to turn this peaceful street into something none of them were ready for. A few hours earlier, before the pointing finger and the street-wide hush, the day had worn its gentlest face, the kind that makes a small town feel like it's holding you in open palms. Sunlight warming the brick fronts of the shops, wind chimes tapping a lazy rhythm outside the antique store, slow traffic rolling by with windows down and radios murmuring, and everybody doing that familiar dance of nods and half-smiles that says, "I know you," or at least, "I know your story." The veteran moved through it like someone who didn't need to announce himself to be noticed. Tall but not looming. Calm in a way that made the space around him calmer. Too, the kind of man whose presence told the nervous system to unclench without anyone knowing why. And at his left heel walked his retired police dog, a broad-chested K9 with an old scar along one ear, and eyes that still held the steady, unblinking intelligence of a working partner, even in retirement. Because some instincts don't retire. They just quiet down until they're needed. The leash was looped neatly in the veteran's hand, not because he feared the dog would bolt, but because ritual and discipline had been their shared language for years. And beside them walked the little girl, small enough that her shadow barely reached the curb. Her blue sweatshirt sleeves pushed up, sticky fingers clutching the last bite of a powdered donut from the diner. And if you listened close, you could hear the soft cadence of her shoes scuffing the sidewalk in time with the dog's pads. A trio moving in a rhythm that felt safe, practiced, like a promise. She wasn't his daughter. Not by blood, but the way he watched the edges of the world for her. Hands, cars, sudden movements made it clear she belonged under his protection today. And the dog seemed to understand that assignment as deeply as any command, occasionally glancing at her with a softness that didn't cancel the vigilance, only framed it. They passed the barber shop and got a wave from the old man, sweeping hair off the mat, past the flower stand and got a cheerful "afternoon" from the woman watering petunias. Past the library and heard laughter spill out as the door opened. And for a while the story could have stayed right there, wrapped in warm normalcy. A simple walk, a small town loop, a child safe between a veteran and a loyal dog. The world predictable and kind. The veteran answered greetings with minimal words. "Ma'am, sir, how's it going?" Not unfriendly, just measured. And he listened more than he spoke, because listening had kept him alive in places where the air itself could turn dangerous. And even here, on a peaceful street lined with hand-painted signs and hanging baskets, his senses stayed tuned. Not paranoid, just aware, the way a seasoned sailor reads subtle changes in water. The K9, too, read things others didn't. The scent trails in crosswalk dust. The nervous energy of a teenager loitering by the bike rack. The way a delivery truck idled a little too long at the curb. And most of the time those readings ended with nothing more than a quiet tail flick and a steady pace. But then, around the time the church bell chimed once for the hour, the air started to feel slightly wrong. And it was so small at first, it could have been dismissed as imagination. Like the sun got a shade brighter, and yet the warmth didn't reach your skin, like the breeze carried a thin metallic note under the smell of coffee and sugar. The little girl slowed without realizing, her donut forgotten, and the dog's head lifted an inch, nostrils widening, not excited, not curious, assessing. The veteran noticed, because he always noticed when his partner noticed, and his eyes tracked the street ahead, not looking for one thing, but for patterns. Who's moving against the flow? Who's lingering too long? Who's watching instead of living? Nothing obvious jumped out. Just shoppers, a couple of teenagers laughing, a man pushing a stroller, a woman stepping out of the pharmacy with a paper bag. But the veteran felt that faint pressure in the quiet behind the sound, like a room where someone has just stopped talking because you walked in. He didn't tighten the leash, didn't pull the girl closer yet, but his hand adjusted on the loop, his posture subtly angling so he could shield her if needed. And the K9, the living lie detector, gave a single, almost imperceptible pause at the edge of a crosswalk, eyes scanning the same direction as his handler, as if both of them had just heard something the rest of the town couldn't. Something that said this calm isn't going to last. Back in the present, that thin, metallic wrongness snapped into something everyone could feel. Because the little girl didn't just point once and forget. She pointed again, arm straight as a ruler, finger locked on the stranger like she was tracing a line only she could see. And this time there was no hesitation in her posture, no uncertainty in her eyes. Just a child's blunt instinct made sharper by fear. And the man across the sidewalk, who'd been gliding along with that easy, unremarkable pace, slowed as if he'd hit an invisible patch of thick air, his heel landing softer, his shoulders tightening a fraction, his head turning in a way that pretended to be casual, but wasn't. Because the first glance from a crowd is curiosity, and the second is recognition that something is happening. A couple near the ice cream stand paused mid-laugh. The woman with the pharmacy bag stopped walking and stared. And even the teenager leaning on the bike rack lifted his chin, sensing the change in the street's temperature the way you sense a storm before the clouds arrive. The retired K9 transformed in a heartbeat from alert to warning, not with drama, but with precision. His body going so still it looked sculpted, paws planted, spine straight, ears forward like antennae, eyes fixed on the stranger's hands and hips and the small movements that broadcast intent. And the leash vibrated with the tension of a coiled spring. The kind of tension that isn't about aggression, but about readiness. About a dog trained to hold the line. The handler felt it through his fingers and understood it instantly, the way you understand a language you've spoken in life or death moments. And without raising his voice or making a show, he stepped forward, shifting his weight, widening his stance, putting his body between the stranger and the child with the smooth, practiced economy of someone who had done it in alleys and doorways and dim hallways, someone who knew that 1 inch in the wrong direction could become a tragedy. Behind him, he felt the girl's breath hitch, felt her small presence press closer to his back, and he didn't turn fully, didn't break eye contact with the unknown man. But he let one hand drift behind him, palm open, a silent instruction for her to stay, to hold his belt or the back of his jacket if she needed an anchor. The stranger's face pulled up that polite smile again, the kind people wear when they want to appear harmless while measuring how far they can push. And he lifted his hands slightly, palms half out in a performance of innocence. But the handler's eyes weren't on the smile. They were on the micro details. The way the man's gaze flicked past him toward the child. The way his jaw tightened when the dog growled. The way one hand hovered a second too long near a jacket pocket before he remembered to keep it visible. The dog's growl deepened. A low, controlled sound that rolled across the sidewalk and into the space between strangers like a warning line drawn in sand. And for the first time, people stepped back. Not because they were afraid of the dog, but because they were afraid of what the dog was afraid of. And that is a different kind of fear altogether. A stroller wheel squeaked as a mother pulled her baby away. A man near the diner door held it open, but didn't go inside, frozen in that indecisive half-motion. And someone's phone rose instinctively, camera lens catching the tension like a net. The handler spoke at last, voice calm enough to sound almost polite. but edged with the kind of authority that doesn't come from a badge alone. It comes from knowing exactly what you're prepared to do if the next second goes wrong. "Sir," he said, steady and clear, "stop right there." And the stranger let out a small laugh that didn't match his eyes. Glancing around at the bystanders, as if to recruit them into his innocence, but the street had already shifted sides without saying it out loud, because a child pointing with that certainty, a K9 holding that stillness, and a veteran placing himself like a shield, created a picture that made everyone's instincts lean the same direction. The stranger took one more half step, testing the line, and the dog's growl cut sharper. The handler's grip tightened, and the space between them narrowed into a single fragile moment where the next move, one wrong reach, one wrong word, could turn this sunny, friendly block into the beginning of something far darker. The stranger's smile widened, as if the whole scene were some harmless misunderstanding, like a dog had barked at the mailman and everyone was being a little dramatic. And he lifted his chin with that smooth, practiced charm that plays well in public. The kind that relies on people's discomfort with confrontation, because most decent folks would rather doubt themselves than call out danger, especially when danger wears clean clothes and a friendly face. He chuckled, eyes flicking over the gathering bystanders as though inviting them to share in the joke. And then he took a slow step forward, not fast enough to look threatening, just steady enough to reclaim control of the space. "Easy there," he said, voice light, almost teasing. "It's just a dog, right? And look at her. She's pointing like I stole her candy." And a few nervous laughs rippled from the edge of the crowd, not because anyone found it funny, but because laughter is a shield people raise when they don't know what else to do. A woman near the flower stand shifted her weight and looked away. A man in a work shirt glanced at his shoes, and someone muttered, "Maybe it's nothing," as if saying it could make it true. Because accusing a stranger in public felt like stepping onto thin ice. What if you're wrong? What if you ruin someone's life? What if the town turns on you for causing a scene? And that hesitation created a vacuum. The stranger tried to fill, his body angling slightly as he moved, attempting to drift around the handler's shoulder the way water finds a gap in a dam. The dog didn't move an inch, but the growl vibrated deeper, a steady, controlled warning that didn't rise into chaos. And that was the eerie part. This wasn't a pet reacting to noise. This was a trained animal reading a threat with professional certainty. The handler's expression remained composed, almost unreadable. But his eyes stayed coldly attentive, tracking the stranger's approach like a camera on a rail. And when he spoke again, his words were simple, precise, and final. "Stop," he said, not loud, not theatrical, just firm enough that it cut through the stranger's performative tone. And he held up one hand in a clear boundary, palm out, the universal signal that didn't require explanation. For a second, the street balanced on that line. The dog's quiet menace, the child's small trembling certainty, the handler's calm wall. And you could see the crowd wrestling with itself, people wanting to believe there was an innocent explanation, people wanting the veteran to be wrong because the alternative meant something ugly had just walked into their afternoon. The stranger's smile faltered at the edges, not because he was afraid, but because he hated the feeling of being checked, of being told no in front of an audience. And that contempt flashed through him like a crack in glass, quick but visible if you knew what to look for. He tilted his head, feigning confusion, then let his voice sharpen a notch. "Seriously?" he said, spreading his hands wider now, palms up, as if offering himself to the crowd's judgment. "Is this what we're doing? We're letting a dog decide who can walk on a sidewalk?" And he stepped again, closer, too close, ignoring the handler's instruction as though rules were for other people. "I'm just passing through." he added, eyes sliding past the handler to the little girl behind him. Maybe she should learn not to point at strangers. And the way he said it, like a lesson, like a threat wrapped in a joke, made the hair rise on the back of more than one neck. The little girl's fingers curled into the fabric of the handler's jacket, her knuckles whitening, and the dog's growl cut into a lower register that seemed to press against the pavement itself. Still controlled but heavier, like thunder held in a chest, the handler didn't flinch, didn't escalate with anger, because anger would feed the stranger's performance. And instead he repeated the instruction in the same steady tone, the kind that leaves no space for negotiation. Stop where you are, he said. And this time there was an added weight behind the words, a procedural edge, as if each syllable was a step in a larger chain of consequences. The stranger's eyes narrowed, and for the first time he stopped trying to charm and started trying to dominate, shifting his stance forward, shoulders squaring, voice dropping enough to lose its friendliness. Or what? He asked. And the question wasn't aimed only at the handler. It was aimed at the whole street, daring anyone to pick a side, daring them to admit, out loud, that something about him didn't belong here. And as the crowd froze in that familiar paralysis, afraid of being wrong, afraid of being involved, the handler held his ground like a line drawn in stone, knowing that the next move would reveal whether this man was merely offended or dangerous. The moment the stranger challenged him, something invisible but decisive clicked inside the veteran, the way it always had when a situation crossed from uncertain into actionable, and his mind shifted smoothly into mission mode without changing the calm mask on his face. Because panic telegraphs weakness and anger, invites chaos, and neither had ever kept anyone safe. His eyes moved with quiet precision, cataloging micro details most people never notice. The stranger's hands, held out too openly now, fingers slightly tense as if rehearsing a motion. The jacket pocket that bulged just enough to suggest weight without shape. The scuffed toe of one shoe that hinted at uneven wear. The way his posture leaned forward when challenged instead of back. A tell that said he advanced under pressure rather than retreated. The veteran adjusted his stance by inches, rotating his hips so his body formed a solid barrier. And without turning his head, he shifted the little girl fully behind him, his elbow angling just enough that she could tuck herself into the safe pocket at his back, where his center of gravity was strongest, where a sudden movement would have to go through him first. At the same time, his grip on the leash changed, not tighter, just anchored, wrapping it once more around his wrist in a practiced motion that locked the canine at his left side, heel aligned, chest square, a living wall of muscle and instinct that needed no verbal command to understand the assignment. The dog's fixation sharpened into something almost unnerving to watch, his gaze never leaving the stranger's midline, head perfectly still, ears forward, tail low and motionless, like a statue carved to depict alertness itself. And it was that stillness that drew the crowd's attention more than the growl ever had, because people expect noise from danger. But silence unsettles them, especially when it radiates confidence. The handler's peripheral vision caught the flicker of movement among the bystanders, someone edging closer, someone lifting a phone higher, someone whispering. And he used it without acknowledging it, letting his eyes briefly meet those of a middle-aged man standing near the diner door, a man with a sensible haircut and a phone already in his hand. And he gave a subtle nod, nothing dramatic, just a small, unmistakable signal paired with a glance toward the stranger and then down the street, the kind of nonverbal communication that says, call for help without ever saying the words, because keeping the temperature low mattered more than making a scene. The stranger noticed the glance and stiffened. his eyes darting to the onlookers, recalculating. And that recalculation told the veteran more than any confession could, because innocent people don't scan for witnesses that way. And the dog seemed to read the same thing, his chest expanding on a slow inhale, growl dropping a fraction deeper, not louder, just more resolved, like a line had been crossed in some internal ledger only he could see. The handler spoke again, his voice steady enough to sound almost conversational. "Stay right there," he said, phrasing it as instruction rather than threat, because instruction implies authority and authority implies consequence. And his hand stayed open, palm out, not aggressive, just immovable. Behind him, the little girl pressed her forehead briefly against the back of his jacket, seeking the reassurance of solid fabric and steady breathing. And he shifted his weight slightly so she could feel the grounded certainty of his stance, the promise that he was not going anywhere. The crowd watched now in a different way. Not frozen, but focused. Drawn by the dog's unwavering stare like moths to a flame. Because animals don't perform innocence or guilt, they react to what is, and the longer the K9 held that line, the harder it became for anyone to dismiss the moment as a misunderstanding. The stranger's jaw flexed, his smile long gone, and for a fleeting instant, the veteran saw the flash of calculation give way to irritation, then to something sharper, something that resented being seen too clearly. And as the handler kept his body angled protectively, leash anchored, eyes locked, he knew that whatever was buried beneath the man's normal act was pressing closer to the surface now, and that the dog, faithful and relentless, had no intention of looking away. The siren never came, not at first, because small towns don't always move with urgency until the danger is undeniable. But a few minutes after that subtle nod from the veteran, a local uniform appeared from down the block. More security than serious law, the kind of officer who knew everyone's names and preferred problems that could be fixed with a smile. And he approached with a hands-on-belt stroll, like he was walking into a disagreement about a parking space rather than a street that had gone unnaturally quiet. All right," the officer called out in a warm, practiced tone, forcing a chuckle as if laughter could loosen the tension. "What's going on here?" And several bystanders exhaled with visible relief because authority, even soft authority, gives people permission to stop thinking for themselves. The stranger seized the opening immediately, turning to the officer with a wounded expression, palms up again. "Officer, thank you," he said, voice returning to friendly performance. "This guy's dog is going nuts, and now everyone's staring at me like I did something." And he glanced at the crowd as if to say, "See what I mean?" Then flicked his eyes briefly toward the child, a micro look that made the K9's growl thicken. The officer lifted both hands in an appeasing gesture and angled his body toward the veteran. "Come on now," he said with folksy ease. "I'm sure it's probably nothing. Dogs get worked up, kids get spooked, happens all the time." And he gave the K9 an uncertain glance, the kind you give a storm cloud you hope will drift away. The veteran didn't take the bait, didn't match the light tone, because the dog's posture was still carved from warning, and the girl's fingers were still clenched in his jacket, and he kept his voice measured, procedural. "Officer," he said, clear and calm, "I'm requesting you do a proper check. Identify him, confirm what's in his pockets and bag, and create a report." And the phrase "proper check" landed with weight, not as an insult, but as a standard, the way professionals speak when they're anchoring a situation to rules instead of feelings. The local officer's smile tightened, eyes flicking from the veteran to the crowd and back. And the veteran could see him wrestling with the inconvenience of paperwork, the fear of escalation, and something else, recognition, because the officer's gaze lingered on the stranger a second too long. Not suspiciously, but familiarly. Like he'd seen him in a different setting, under different lighting. Maybe shaking hands with the mayor at a ribbon cutting or sitting at a table with the town's important people. "Look," the officer said, lowering his voice slightly as he stepped closer to the veteran, still trying to keep it friendly for the crowd. "I hear you, but we don't need to turn this into a whole thing." And he waved his hand like he was shooing away a fly. "He says he's just passing through." Then, quieter still, with a sideways glance that felt like a warning, he added, "And he's connected." The word slipping out like an excuse that tried to sound like information. Connected. One word that made the veteran's stomach sink. Not because it was new, but because it confirmed the pattern he'd learned the hard way. Danger often wears a network, and networks protect their own. The veteran kept his face still, but his eyes cooled another degree. "Connected doesn't change procedure," he replied. And his tone was polite enough to avoid open conflict, but firm enough to refuse compromise. If a child is pointing and a trained K9 is signaling threat, you document it. And the officer's expression shifted again, irritation briefly flashing through the folksy veneer. "Buddy," he murmured, leaning in as if sharing advice. "You don't want to make enemies in a town like this," and the implication landed like a stone. "You can't win here, because the rules bend for certain people." Behind them, the stranger smiled to himself, small and satisfied, because he'd heard the word connected too, and it settled on his shoulders like an invisible cloak. And the crowd, sensing the change, hesitated all over again. Some looking away, some pretending to check their phones, some stepping back as if distance could keep them out of it. The dog stayed locked, unblinking, a living anchor of truth in a street suddenly thick with excuses. And the veteran realized, with a quiet chill that had nothing to do with the weather, that this was not a random encounter on a sunny sidewalk. It was a protected problem. And the first line of defense in this town was already trying to sweep it under the rug. The veteran felt the familiar frustration of watching procedure get softened into suggestion. But he didn't let it show. Because the only thing more dangerous than a protected man was a protected man who knew you were emotional. And while the local officer tried to steer the moment back into normalcy with a placating half smile, the retired K9 made a decision that cut through every excuse like a blade through paper. He broke his statue-still fixation with a single, deliberate step. Not toward the stranger's face, not toward his hands, but toward the man's messenger bag hanging at his hip. And the movement was so precise it looked rehearsed. Nose lowering, nostrils flaring, then stopping at the bag's bottom seam where the fabric folded over itself. And the dog's posture changed from warning to indication, the way trained dogs do when they've locked onto a source rather than a general threat. The stranger reacted instantly, too fast for innocence, his hand snapping down toward the bag in a protective reflex. But the veteran's leash control tightened, and the K9 held, not lunging, just pointing with his entire body, nose hovering inches from a strip of cheap duct tape that didn't match the bag's material. A taped seam that looked at first glance like an ugly repair job, the kind you'd make if you didn't care about appearances. But the veteran cared about details. And the tape wasn't frayed like old tape, it was clean-edged, freshly pressed, and it ran in a straight line that made no sense for a simple patch. "Don't touch it," the veteran said, voice low and flat. And the stranger froze mid-motion, then pulled his hand back slowly, as if he'd meant to do something else, his smile returning in pieces. "It's just a bag," he said, trying to sound amused. "You people are acting like I've got a bomb in here." And the word bomb hung in the air like a dropped match, making a few bystanders flinch, making the little girl's grip tighten, making the local officer's eyes widen just enough to show he'd lost control of his own script. The veteran didn't react to the bait, because the dog was still indicating, and he'd learned long ago that when a canine holds a line like that, you treat it as information, not drama. So he shifted his phone in his free hand, thumb moving with practiced speed, camera opening without fanfare, and he angled the lens not at faces, but at facts. The bag's taped seam, the dog's nose hovering at it, the stranger's hand hovering, then retreating, the local officer standing there, minimizing while a trained animal signaled something specific. The screen caught sunlight, reflected the scene back in crisp digital clarity, and the veteran made sure the timestamp was visible, because time is the spine of truth when people later try to twist the story. And he narrated softly as he recorded, not for the crowd, but for the record. Subject carrying messenger bag, bottom seam appears taped. K9 indicates its seam. Subject reached for bag when approached. Each phrase calm, factual, immune to interpretation. Around them, the crowd started filming too, because once one phone rises, others follow. And suddenly the stranger's greatest tool, public discomfort, became his trap. The street turning into a ring of lenses that didn't care about his charm. And the local officer's folksy confidence began to melt under the heat of documentation. "All right, let's all relax," he said too loudly. But nobody relaxed. Not when the dog's growl had faded into a tense silence, and his nose remained locked to that strip of tape like it was a siren, only he could smell. The stranger tried to laugh it off again, but his eyes kept flicking from phone to phone, calculating angles, counting witnesses, and in that darting gaze the veteran saw the first real crack of worry, because if the tape was nothing, there'd be no need to fear a camera. Then the wind shifted, bringing a sharper scent across the sidewalk. Chemical, faint, like adhesive and plastic warmed in sun. And the canine's lips curled just enough to show a line of teeth. Not in attack, but in warning. And the little girl whispered, almost to herself, "That's him." As if she'd recognized not just the man, but the feeling around him. The veteran took one more step to keep his body between the child and the bag, keeping the leash short, keeping the phone steady. And as the local officer hesitated, caught between protecting a connected stranger and protecting his own reputation on a street full of cameras, a small, ordinary detail became the loudest thing in the world. The edge of the tape lifting slightly at one corner, revealing a thin line of different material beneath, not fabric, not leather. Something sealed, something hidden, something that suggested this wasn't a random passerby at all, but a man carrying a compartment built for concealment, the kind of concealment that doesn't happen by accident, the kind that whispers one terrifying idea into the veteran's mind as the first domino teetered, organized. Hard cut, no gentle transition, no warning. Into a private room where the air smelled like polished wood, expensive cologne, and stale authority. A room designed to feel calm even when it was planning harm. And on the wall, a muted television glowed with the same sidewalk scene now playing on loop. The little girl's outstretched finger, the retired canine's rigid stillness, the veteran's steady hand holding a leash like a lifeline, and the stranger's messenger bag with that clean strip of tape catching sunlight like a confession. The man watching from a leather chair was dressed the way pillars always are. Tailored jacket, crisp collar, a watch that looked like it could buy a small car, his hair perfect, his expression controlled, but his eyes hard with a kind of impatience that came from believing the town belonged to him. And beside him stood a nervous underling in a wrinkled shirt, fingers fidgeting with a pen as if it could anchor him. His gaze bouncing between the screen and the pillar's face like a dog waiting to see whether it would be fed or kicked. The pillar didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. because men like him learned early that quiet is more frightening than shouting. "This is not ideal," he murmured, almost bored, as the clip jumped to the moment the canine's nose found the taped seam and the underling swallowed. "It's already everywhere," he said, voice thin. "Local pages, town groups. People are sharing it like crazy." And the pillar's mouth tightened as if he'd tasted something bitter. "Then we correct the narrative," he replied, eyes never leaving the screen, as if he could will the footage to change by staring at it. On a side table sat a tablet showing rising view counts, comments multiplying like ants, strangers praising the veteran's calm, calling the dog a hero, asking why the local officer looked like he was protecting the stranger, and each question was a needle sliding into the pillar's patience. "We can't have this turning into a thing," he said. And the way he paused before a thing made it sound like an infection, something that spreads if you don't cut it out, and the underling nodded too fast. "No, sir, of course not," he rushed. "But the dog, people trust the dog." And at that, the pillar finally looked away from the screen, eyes narrowing with cold clarity. "People trust what we allow them to trust," he said, and his voice lowered into the coded language of respectable men discussing dirty work without ever naming it. "Progress is delicate. Investors don't like noise. Families don't like fear. We keep progress on track by making problems disappear." And the underling's throat bobbed as if he'd tried to swallow his conscience whole. The pillar tapped a finger once on the armrest, a small sound that felt like a gavel. "First," he said, "retrieve the item." And the underling hesitated. "The bag?" he asked. And the pillar's eyes sharpened. "The compartment," he corrected, as if the distinction mattered, as if he was irritated the underling didn't understand the architecture of concealment. "Whatever is inside that seam does not leave our control. Then, second," he continued, "intimidate witnesses." And he didn't say it with anger. He said it like reading a grocery list. Phone calls, friendly visits, employers reminded of favors, leases suddenly questioned, a quiet pressure that makes people decide they never saw anything at all. "Third," he said, leaning forward slightly now, "discredit the veteran." And the underling's eyes flicked up in alarm, because discrediting a calm protector required crafting a villain out of a hero. "He's respected," the underling whispered. "He's a man with a past," the pillar cut in smoothly, as if he'd already opened the file. "Everyone has something. Make him look unstable. Make him look like he's chasing attention. Make it about ego." He gestured at the screen where the veteran's phone recorded the tape. "Make that footage look like theater." Then the pillar's gaze shifted to the freeze frame of the little girl's face, small and certain, and his expression cooled even further. "And finally," he said, voice almost gentle, "the child's story goes away." And the underling flinched at the softness of that phrase, because it was the most sinister thing in the room. "How?" he managed, and the pillar offered the slightest smile. Not warm, not amused. Satisfied. "Children forget," he said. "Parents relocate. Schools discourage drama. Social workers file papers. People do what's best for their families when reminded what they stand to lose." And he stood, smoothing his jacket, stepping closer to the television as the clip replayed the K9's unwavering stare. "This town runs on the belief that everything is fine," he murmured, as if speaking to the dog through the screen. "We are not going to let one veteran and a retired animal rewrite that belief." Then he turned to the underling, and the room seemed to dim around the simple weight of his next words. "I want this contained before nightfall." And as the underling nodded with shaking hands, The pillar reached out and paused the video on the exact frame where the tape corner lifted, proof peeking out. Then he whispered, almost reverently, "Close the seam." And the order landed like a door locking. By late afternoon, the pressure arrived like weather you can feel in your teeth. Quiet at first, then suddenly everywhere. Because the veteran hadn't even made it 2 blocks from the incident before a black SUV rolled slow behind him, like it had been all the time in the world, and when he glanced at its tinted windows, he saw nothing but his own reflection staring back, steady and unsmiling. His phone buzzed with an unknown number, and when he answered, a man's voice spoke with friendly menace wrapped in small-town politeness. "You had your moment, hero," the voice said. "Now do the smart thing and let it go." And the line went dead before the veteran could reply, leaving only the hum of traffic and the faint jingle of the dog's collar like a metronome counting down. That night, the diner cashier who'd been filming from the doorway found her phone screen shattered in her apron pocket as if it had cracked itself. And when she swore she'd felt a bump in the crowd, her manager frowned and told her not to get involved. Because his cousin's lease renewal was coming up, and some people don't like trouble. And just like that, the town's warm friendliness began to feel conditional, like kindness that could be revoked. A man who'd posted the clearest angle of the taped seam deleted his video after 2 suited strangers visited his auto shop and asked, smiling, whether he'd checked his insurance lately. And a teenage witness got pulled aside by a school office worker the next morning and warned about spreading rumors as if truth were a contagious disease. The local officer who'd tried to minimize the incident showed up at the veteran's temporary lodging with an awkward half-grin, hands clasped like a man delivering bad news. He didn't want attached to his name. "Listen," he said, keeping his voice low in the hallway. "You made your point, all right? People saw the clip, it's out there, but you're poking at something bigger than you." And when the veteran asked for the report number, the officer's eyes slid away. "There isn't one," he admitted, then added, almost pleading, "I'm trying to help you. These folks, they don't lose." And that was the moment the veteran understood the town wasn't just afraid of the stranger. It was afraid of the network behind him. The retired K9 sensed the shift too, tracking every passing car with that old professional focus, pausing at windows, staring down alley mouths, growling once, quiet, warning, when footsteps lingered too long outside their door. And the little girl, usually resilient, began to startle at small sounds, clutching the veteran's sleeve as if the world had changed shape, and she didn't know how to trust it again. Then, on the second night after the sidewalk incident, as rain began tapping the roof in soft, insistent fingers, there came a knock that wasn't casual but wasn't frantic either. 3 measured raps, a pause, then 2 more. And the veteran opened the door to find a woman standing under the hallway light with damp hair tucked behind her ears, a plain coat, and eyes that looked like they hadn't slept in days, her hands held up empty in the universal signal of, "I'm not a threat." The K9 moved to the threshold immediately, body still, nose working, reading her the way he read everyone, and after a tense heartbeat, his posture softened a fraction. Not relaxed, but not warning, like the lie detector had just found something rare in this town. Sincerity. "You're the handler?" the woman whispered, voice strained as if every word hurt to release. "The one with the dog." And when the veteran didn't answer, she swallowed and stepped closer, just enough to slide something small across the floor with the toe of her shoe. Careful not to make a sound. A plain flash drive wrapped in a plastic bag. And behind it, folded papers sealed in a clear envelope that looked like it had been hidden inside a wall. "I work near people who think they own this place," she said, eyes flicking to the stairwell as if expecting footsteps. "I was told to Clean up what happened on Main Street. Her mouth trembled with disgust. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that it was just business, just progress. But then I saw the little girl's face, and I heard that dog, like he was staring straight through the lies. And I couldn't do it anymore. And when the same veteran asked what it was, the woman's voice dropped to a near whisper. Security logs, delivery schedules, payment records, she said. Names that don't appear in public, but they appear in receipts, in gate entries, in the same vehicles showing up at the same places. Then she nodded toward the drive, and the clip from a private camera that never should have existed. Footage of that stranger picking up that bag from a back entrance 2 hours before he walked your street. And the rain outside intensified as if the sky itself was leaning in to listen. The canine's ears pricked toward the stairwell again, and the woman's final words landed like a match thrown into gasoline. He wasn't passing through, she said, eyes shining with fear and resolve. He was running an errand, and someone upstairs is already sending people to get this back. The dominoes didn't fall all at once. They fell the way truth always does when it finally finds air. First with a sharp crack, then with a rolling thunder that no one can stop, because the veteran didn't take the insider's flash drive to the same local desk that had already tried to bury the sidewalk incident. He took it past the town's soft boundaries and into the hands of an outside unit, with no friendships to protect, no ribbon-cutting photos on office walls. And when the first state investigators stepped out of an unmarked sedan the next morning, the entire street seemed to tighten like a drum, the air heavy with the smell of rain-soaked asphalt and inevitability. The investigator didn't smile, didn't soothe, didn't ask for favors. She asked for facts, and the veteran gave them in clean, time-stamped order, handing over his footage, the insider's documents, and the drive that held the private camera clip showing the stranger collecting the taped bag from a back entrance. A clip that turned passing through into a lie with a time code. By noon, the outside team had secured warrants, and the first arrest happened with almost brutal simplicity. The stranger, caught leaving a rented room on the edge of town, messenger bag now replaced with a different one that looked too new, too intentional. His charm evaporating as cuffs clicked, and he realized the network's blanket didn't cover him from outsiders who didn't care who he knew. Within hours, the investigators moved on the enforcers, the men in suits who'd leaned on witnesses, the driver of the black SUV, the local fixer who'd made phones break and videos vanish. And each arrest peeled back another layer of the town's false calm, until people started whispering not in fear, but in shock, because they were watching something rare. Consequences. The local officer who'd minimized the scene stood on the sidewalk with his hat in his hands when he saw the state badge, his face pale and ashamed. And for the first time he admitted out loud that he'd been told to let the stranger go because important people didn't want noise. And that confession, recorded and signed, became another domino. The protected pillar tried to move like he always had, through back channels, through friendly calls, through the assumption that the town would shield him. But when agents stepped into his polished office and placed a folder on his desk filled with gate entries, receipt trails, payment records, and the inside camera footage that linked him to the errand, his calm veneer cracked for the first time, and the veteran watched from across the street as a man who'd once seemed untouchable was escorted out in handcuffs, his expensive watch flashing under gray daylight like a final insult. The crowd that gathered wasn't cheering. Not exactly. There was relief, yes, but also a sickening recognition. The kind that makes a community look at itself and realize how long it had mistaken silence for peace. How often it had chosen comfort over courage. How easily it had let connected become a shield for wrongdoing. In the days that followed, The town's mood shifted like weather clearing after a storm. Windows opened, conversations grew louder. People started telling the truth in pieces, apologizing for looking away, for laughing nervously, for calling it probably nothing. And the insider who'd brought the drive gave a full statement under protection, shaking but steady, finally unburdening herself of the role she'd been forced to play. The little girl was moved somewhere safe, not hidden as punishment, but protected as promise. And the veteran stayed close through the transition, his presence a calm anchor while new adults with clean badges and careful eyes took over the long work of repair. The retired K-9, praised as a hero by strangers online, remained unmoved by attention, accepting gentle pats only from trusted hands, eyes still scanning doorways, still reading the air, because loyalty doesn't switch off just because the threat is gone. It remembers. Weeks later, when the legal headlines had cooled and the town began rebuilding its sense of itself, the veteran and the dog walked the same downtown block again, sunlight returning, wind chimes tapping, the diner doors swinging open with its familiar fan hum. But the atmosphere felt cleaner, like a stain had finally been scrubbed from the world. And as they passed the flower stand, the woman watering petunias didn't just wave. She looked the veteran in the eyes and said, "Thank you," with a sincerity that carried more weight than any applause. The street, once frozen by fear of accusation, now held a different kind of quiet, the quiet of accountability settling into place. And yet the veteran didn't forget the lesson burned into that first moment of stillness. Because as the dog paused at the old streetlight and lifted his head, nostrils flaring at a scent long gone, the veteran understood the last sting of it all. What his partner had sensed that day wasn't merely a threat walking by in a clean jacket. It was a lie that had been living in the town for years, hiding in polite smiles, protected by comfortable people, and only exposed because a child pointed, a dog refused to look away, and a veteran chose truth over silence.